Welcome to Voices,
a podcast from the Institute for Human Rights and Business.
Here, we're seeking to elevate the range of perspectives
on the role of business in the world
and in people's everyday lives.
Hello, everybody. I'm Salil Tripathi with the Institute for Human Rights and Business. And we are going to talk about a very fundamental development that has taken place in the space of free speech, technology, and human rights in the past week. Facebook is a company that has an impact on literally 1 out of every 6 or 7 individuals on the planet. It probably has more users than the population of China and India taken together, give or take a few million. Vast impact on politics, vast impact on business, vast impact on the society, what we read, what we eat, how our behavior is shaped, how we act. It has been able to connect people and reassure them during conflict and natural disasters. You are lost, you can tell your loved ones you are safe. You have ways of reaching out to people you cannot otherwise. During crisis like what's happening in Myanmar today, you're able to go through certain barriers and meet and reassure people you're fine. At the same time, the platform has been accused of fomenting conflict not just in Sri Lanka, not just in Myanmar, but also Facebook itself felt it was necessary to suspend the privileges that the former US President Donald Trump had. Now, 17 years after the company has come into shape as we know it, it's no longer just a social network. It is Facebook, one of the largest corporations in the world. It has developed its own human rights policy. Now, the huge responsibility of steering this human rights policy and making it work rests on the shoulders of my guest today, Miranda Sissons. Those of us who are familiar with the human rights field over the years probably know her name definitely through her work at the International Center for Transition Justice and more recently at Human Rights Watch. She comes with exceptionally great credentials on human rights. And for once, from being a critic of the powerful, she is now seen as the face of the powerful, facing critics. And she has to try to reform the situation within and try to reassure the world that Facebook means business when it comes to human rights policies. Since Miranda's arrival, Facebook has seen the creation of an oversight board, the so-called Supreme Court, which is going to help the company navigate the space of what to retain, what not to retain. It's going to soon decide on whether the decision to suspend President Trump was the right one or not. It has published human rights impact assessments, a process that had started earlier of pretty difficult countries. And it has begun dialogue, again, reinitiated the dialogue with the civil society, flagged content, warned people about things that are wrong from the human rights perspective, wrong from health information. And now it has a human rights policy. So Miranda, tell us, first of all, welcome. What prompted Facebook to have this very specific policy on human rights? And to what extent was it guided by external drivers and external factors and the criticism? And to what extent was it a need felt internally?
Thank you so much, Salil. What an impressive introduction. I'll aspire to live up to the billing that you've given me. And it is delightful to be here. I came on board at Facebook in August 2019. And at that time, we had begun, I think, some of the initiatives that you're mentioning. So I think it's important to see the human rights policy as an important step, but one more step on a human rights journey. Now, that journey initially began, I think, in 2013 when Facebook joined the Global Network Initiative. And with other companies that are members of the GNI, it committed to certain principles and implementation principles, but in particular to protect freedom of expression and privacy as defined in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. That journey obviously had to deepen. And the experience in Myanmar after 2017 and the HRIA was a fundamental step from which a number of reforms and changes have spread out through the company. They include changes that were already happening when I came on board, such as increased human rights due diligence on very difficult contexts, investment in a very big engineering work stream to try and prevent the misuse of Facebook and its products in contexts where there's risks of societal violence, and also a number of significant initiatives on the supply chain side, which receive far less comment, but obviously are a very important part of business and human rights. So when I came on board and looking at the landscape, it was clear that, first of all, there had already been internal interest in a human rights policy. There was already external interest and recommendations from human rights due diligence for such a policy, and that we needed to think hard and act hard to develop one. And I would say that it was very important to us in framing this and in working on this, that we needed to learn and understand our risks, and to do this authentically if it was going to be useful. So whipping out a policy in a month wasn't going to be either useful or satisfy people, but it had to be another action step. And that's what we were trying to achieve through the policy relief.
The key elements of the policy, if you can just quickly run through, because it's in 3 specific components. There's an internal aspect to it, there's an external aspect to it, and there are certain groups in which you have specific interest. If you can just walk through that very briefly.
So we framed our policy in line with the mandate of the UN Guiding Principle. So as that format, begin with crystallizing and codifying our commitment to standards. And it's important there that you note that we commit to and recognize a wide range of standards well above the minimum, which is the international bill. Instead, we mention the international bill, the UNGPs, the ILO standards, and many other instruments. Secondly, we talk about how we already implement the policy. And this is kind of a dizzying guide to the complexity of such a large company. We do try to clearly specify the key teams that are already implementing this work. We, in addition, we set out language on due diligence, where we talk about our due diligence, but also commit to an annual human rights report sharing insights and actions from our due diligence, which is not something many companies do. And then we talk about oversight and implementation. And although you billed me as the person responsible for oversight, I'm happy to say it's actually Nick Clegg, and Vice President for Policy, and Jen Newstead, our General Counsel, that are in the hot seat. And I was delighted, we were all delighted that they both sponsored and will be leading implementation. They will be reporting to the board of directors on a regular basis. And then finally, the policy also includes strong language on the need to support human rights defenders. And that is channeling Facebook's traditional interest in human rights defenders, activists, and journalists, and trying to articulate that more forcefully and more strongly as part of the policy. And that's, again, a development that's happening a little bit more in corporate human rights policies, but we thought it was important to make our commitment clear and to mobilize around it.
No, and I think the recognition of defenders, and including journalists that you do mention in the policy, is a good one, certainly. I do have a question about other groups that may have been left out, but I'll come to that. But in the lead up to my questions, I'd mentioned some of the flashpoints, the Sri Lankan case and the Myanmar case, and even the Trump example as being the possibly external drivers which forced you to think. And there is nothing wrong with that. I mean, change always happens when there is a crisis. So there's nothing fundamentally wrong with that. However, my question is that when activists, human rights groups, and victims look at this, their primary concern will, of course, be about the reality, or how real these changes are going to be, and not dictated by the concerns of managing reputation. Because reputation, of course, matters to Facebook. It may be a near monopoly in many ways, but at the same time, reputation does matter. So there will be skepticism. How would you address that skepticism? What would you tell the people who say, this is just nice words?
I would first of all recognize that as an activist myself, for most activists, I think, the premise is that any business and human rights policy are going to be about reputation, and skepticism that any are meaningful, right? So let's I think, be honest about that. I think that the strategy we will be choosing to try and pursue is to show, not tell. The only way people will receive reassurance is if our actions demonstrate a commitment. First of all, you will see that the human rights due diligence disclosures we've done are unusual for the sector and for business as a whole. that the creation of the Oversight Board, which was specifically designed as a remedy under the UN Guiding Principles and is an ambitious and unusual experiment, is another important action. And that the standards and commitments we're making in this policy are, again, I hope, when you poke them, will reveal some serious thought and aspiration. But I think the proof is in the pudding, and we've got to make sure the pudding and proof ratio trend in the right direction, recognizing that some people will always be skeptical, but it's what we do with the platform we are building that matters. And let's check in and see how we go.
Yeah, no, show not tell is a very good way to segue into the question I wanted to ask, which is about what is it that you are showing and what is it that you're reporting? Because you have quite acutely identified one of the central dilemmas that you face, where you said you will strive to resist orders from governments which go against your policies, your beliefs, your code of conduct, and international standards. But the emphasis is to strive to resist, which clearly shows that you may not be able to do it every time. And strong governments can prevail over you. You may be able to, say no to a relatively, I wouldn't say insignificant country, but a relatively powerless country. You may be able to do that. But if it's China, it's Saudi Arabia, it's India, and the ball game changes considerably. I'm not suggesting you to reveal the hand that you hold, but I'm just curious. Is that where you see a partnership or alliance with NGOs, with like-minded governments, with other companies to resist it? Collective action always has an advantage. So I'm just curious how one can resist it.
Collective action is indeed an advantage, but I think there are probably 2 points I'd make before kind of diving more into your question. One is which, first of all, as a member of the Global Network Initiative, Facebook has, and other members, have had pretty strong and sophisticated processes to push back on unlawful government requests for almost 8 years now. And we do publish that. So I would actually push back gently or even firmly on your premise that strong governments get their way. No, right? That's why Navalny is able to use Instagram in Russia. That is why Twitter is in such hot water in India. That is why we routinely, when there has been this incredible flowering of activism and participation and expression in ways that do contest power in the last 10 years, but where the online community and human rights defenders have lost the early adopter advantage that they had in the first 10 years of social media. So we are now in a second phase where with the waves of regulation, some of which is well-intentioned, a lot of which is not, we will be tested like never before because people are seeking, I think, to transform the framework, transform the internet as we know it from free and open. And whether that becomes splintered, whether it's rights respecting or whether it becomes the world's largest internet censorship machine, I don't know. But yes, alliances are important. And also there is the recognition that while people think of these companies as all powerful, and we know, and you will know from publishing, from journalism, from communications, what we had with the internet is we had this moment where all the normal censorship and suppression techniques didn't work for a while, right? And if I think about my own experience in Egypt, when you're trying to do something, the government would just control the supply of paper, but suddenly it didn't matter anymore. And now we're in a position where these requests are many of them are another means of trying to implement the censorship, and some are reasonable requests to address important social harms. So we're stronger as members of the GNI. We're stronger having committed to things. We're stronger with independent assessment of our performance every 2 years and with publishing our transparency reports. But yes, what we actually do when the rubber hits the road and a state puts a fork in our servers, when it blocks access to our services, is important for the whole world. But what we know now, 10 years on, is also that's only a part of our human rights story. It's the easiest part to see, but obviously how people use our services to access the right to livelihood, education in COVID, prevention of misinformation, all of these are multidimensional rights issues. And they become so staggering and so overwhelming, it's very hard, one becomes almost unable to take action because they're so difficult to analyze. And the thing I love about the human rights framework is it helps us analyze, to drive things, to take actionable steps.
Now, you mentioned human rights defenders a couple of times earlier, and they are among the groups that you have identified as a group that requires particular attention. But if one were to look for other groups, there are obviously missing ones. You deliberately chosen not to itemize them. I'm aware of that, but women, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, linguistic minorities, sexual minorities are the ones that are not specifically mentioned. Now, I can see the problem of, as soon as you list, somebody would say, what about this that you have missed out on? But there are specific needs. Women are being stalked, they are being, the deep fakes are being produced, they're being doxxed. Fake videos are being, and they're being shouted out and removed from, and people who put harmless cartoons, they get attacked in various ways, and it's a religious-based persecution. All this is missing. Now, is there an advantage in this strategic ambiguity? Is there a reason to keep it deliberately vague to give you the maneuverability? Or is that something you want to cross the bridge when you get there? What's the thinking behind that?
Yeah, well, I also think this is much larger than our community standards. And the majority of practices that you're noting, or the majority of challenges, actually revolve around the community standards. If you look at the community standards online, you will see a very, very robust recognition of both protected characteristics. I think I'm correct in saying it's certainly the most extensive of any social media company, protecting on gender identity, caste, ethnic and religious status, language status, national origin. But also that we are so large, and intersectionality and vulnerability is so dynamic that regardless of whatever list we sought to capture, it would be insufficient. So we tried to iterate for, to some extent, a policy that we could deliver, which was to say that the risks, the salient human rights risks, are broad and will vary, in almost every context. And then to have strong language and a strong commitment to incorporating the most vulnerable and rights holders in those contexts and in our due diligence, in addition to our stakeholder engagement processes, which are already pretty robust on the policy side. And of course, in addition to the protections that are already in our community standards, because of course we need to think about vulnerability in terms of, for example, in the compliance work we do on our vendor chain, we're not just looking at vulnerability in the community standards, we'll also be looking to do with corruption and other things on the ground.
I want to turn briefly about free speech and the use of the platform. There was this famous speech, I think it was at the American University or George Washington University last year, that Mark Zuckerberg gave, in which he spoke about, it sounded like an ACLU advocate almost, speaking about First Amendment and, how much it means to him. And what thing that he did not want to be deciding who gets to say what on the platform. And at the same time, you always had these community standards, which does allow you to remove certain posts and individuals for periods and extensively. So there is a problem there. And actions taken by the company since then. A classic example, of course, being Donald Trump, the Myanmar army, and so on, where you have actually taken people off. And of course, now the question has gone to another level about how to deal with it. Is it time for Facebook to state, even through think pieces or express its views? Can there be a single Facebook view, for example, on some of the pivotal debates, free speech versus hate speech, information, disinformation versus misinformation, who to deplatform, the whole debate around cancel culture? These are all lively debates in the public arena, and you are at the heart of it.
They are lively debates, and it's incredibly dynamic working in a topic where there's absolutely no consensus on standards of speech, right? And let's be clear that in human rights law, we also have that lack of consensus. I think if you're reading Mark's Georgetown speech, he clearly indicates that very supportive of freedom of expression, but clearly indicates that, at risk of atrocity crimes or where we would, limits that human rights law clearly recognizes, he too recognizes limits. And the community standards, which are based around 5 values that are essentially easy to understand encapsulation of human rights principles, right? Dignity, safety, voice, privacy, and then authenticity, which is your internet special, because that's not really represented in human rights law. That struggle is alive and well, and we are really looking forward, and I'm certainly very interested in the way the Oversight Board is going to articulate what those boundaries might be, because of course they're not boundaries in an academic sense, they're not boundaries in a case-by-case juridical decision-making sense where a court can take 7 years to decide one case. We have 100 billion pieces of content a day. Right, and millions of appeals, I believe, a week. So obviously the premise in human rights law is all speech is permitted except that which is prohibited, right? So let's start with that, right, which is not, and as a human rights activist, we have to start there. And then we say, but yes, there's interpretation, Article 19 and Article 20 of some certain circumstances under which we can or are obliged to limit speech. And with our hate speech policy, our violence and incitement policy, our dangerous organizations policy, we seek to articulate that line. But it's, our understanding of it is going to shift, our consultation on it is going to shift, and our ability to implement that effectively is going to shift, because of course we see what is either detected or reported to us. And that makes all the difference in the world. So a lot of this is not about the policy line, it's about the enforcement, as I'm sure you're aware.
Yeah, this is slightly at a tangent, but I think it's useful to get into this question. And I hear you, I know the whole Section 230 discussion in the US, which is of course part of the Communication Decencies Act, which says that as a carrier, you're not responsible for the content. I mean, you do take certain responsibility as you just articulated, but if you're only a carrier and not responsible for the content, and if you do take the decisions of deplatforming, not just President Trump, it could be a random person ranting and posting lurid images of religious, divinities and, offending a lot of people. Does that mean that inevitably and eventually Facebook will have to face up the fact that it is a kind of a publisher?
At 100 billion posts a day in scores of languages, I don't know anyone that would answer that question in the affirmative that's ever worked in social media. So obviously there are terms of service, but obviously in every regime and in every rule set, there are behaviors under which one can either withdraw service or terminate a business relationship with a person if it's an advertiser, right? So we have all of this complexity in the framework, as well as the human rights oriented issues, but violence and incitement or dangerous organizations under any framework can be prohibited. And of course, we're not talking about the primary challenges of the internet, which are nudity and spam. What's really interesting to me is no human rights activists are actually talking about the major abuse types on our platform, because they're obviously not necessarily human rights problems. But in fact, if we're thinking about the problem set platforms need to solve for, those are incredibly important platforms and also contribute to incredibly negative human user experience, much more, or not always, but in many people's minds is much more intrusive than hate speech, which we are rightly very concerned about, but is dynamic, shifts in context, shifts in meaning, probably shifts with the audience, and where there is no bright line, magic line that we can implement with human rights standards. I think the only bright line that exists is direct and public incitement to genocide, and in general, most situations where that is occurring, people are too smart to articulate that anymore on the platform.
Yeah, and I think the other interesting challenge that you will face, and you probably already have faced many times, is portraying or presenting content, usually visual content, which is profoundly offensive in certain ways. And I'm not talking about pornography but things such as the example I have, which is not a Facebook example, but this was, I think, a YouTube example, was of Neda Sultan. If you remember, this was this young woman in Iran who was shot and she fell down and her eyes were open and blood was trickling down and she died. And this was, I think, about 10, 12 years ago, at the time of when Twitter was, Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State. So I'm talking about that long ago. And people said that, this was a war crime being glorified. And Victoria Grant, who was at that time YouTube's chief legal person, she said, but tomorrow you will tell me not to show Holocaust images of concentration camps, saying that it's offensive. But for historical record, these images are important. And again, my question there is, who gets to decide these things? And Is it conceivable, for example, that you would have regional experts, historical experts, religious experts who can guide these decisions, or will you rely only on yourself, or take the best decision you can and then amend it based on the feedback you get? I'm thinking aloud now. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's very good thinking. And it's absolutely, I mean, this is a dynamic context where, you know, the platforms need to evolve what they do. And this dilemma, first of all, let's acknowledge also that just like there's no consensus on speech, there's no consensus on any of these topics, because people have very different attitudes, and information or content can serve multiple different needs in multiple different contexts. It's not static. So one person's war crime that's offensive is another person's desperately important piece of evidence that they need to preserve, and for another person it's awareness raising. What I think Facebook has been trying to do, and again, before I came on board, was that it has quite a dynamic policy development process. So I think that one fundamental point that it took me a while to understand is that, of course, as a human rights activist, I'm used to governments and the UN doing policies, right? And it takes years and years, nothing ever changes. And you have to go with the UN 20 years before you get it rake and working. Whereas, in fact, in tech, you can iterate your policies pretty quickly. And there is, in fact, an acceptance that you are going to iterate and improve, because everybody's just working this out, and B, your enforcement and digital capacity and statistical knowledge improves the longer you operate. And you also get a very important user and community feedback about those policies. So, for example, Facebook runs a stakeholder engagement team with stakeholder engagement principles, where they do quite consistently try and get global stakeholder and rights holder engagement with every policy change. And those constituencies obviously shift, but they do obviously maximize and try and solve for rights holders, stakeholders, academics, the most vulnerable in every context, human rights experts, legal experts, community advocates, and incorporate that. So I think the answer is it will not be good to make these decisions on our own. It isn't. But there will be decisions that need to be made. And those decisions are going to be strongest if they're aligned with basic human rights principles that are clearly articulated, such as voice, dignity, and safety. So one example of the kind of content that you're indicating is that we would keep it on the platform, but mark it with an interstitial, so that people that didn't want to see it could not see it, but that it would remain searchable and findable for people who did wish to use it in that way. But that there is a line of activity which is so abhorrent that we will simply remove. And there are quite detailed requirements for that. Sadly, one of my first weeks at Facebook, I think there were videos of a paramilitary group that was beheading people in an active conflict on the platform with very gruesome footage. And that will be an example that while we would, that is often, because this is social media, it's live before it's detected or reported. So somebody somewhere has probably seen it, but that is an example of what we would bring down, right? So there are limits to the absolute. But working to define those limits and then to create backup mechanisms for sharing and supporting an entire information ecosystem is where there's a lot to do. And every day we face a dodecahedron of questions, which is really about is where are we in the ecosystem? How can the ecosystem work? But also takes me back to the UNGP framework, where the UNGPs, as unsexy as they are, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, direct companies to prioritize human rights harms based on scope, severity, remediability, and also on the manner in which the company is involved with those harms. Is it causing, contributing, or linked? Now, on social media, you can make anything can be an argument of contribution, and that is very, very hard, right? But you must prioritize, right? So the prioritization I have learned in the last 18 months is absolutely key. And one thing I will do, based on certainly my own knowledge as a human rights activist and documentation researcher, is that you seek to prevent the violence before you prioritize the evidence, right? The evidence is never more important than people's lives. But once you've secured the stuff, then you go to the evidence. And having that using the UNGPs to supply you with the categorical imperative is in fact very useful, I find. So there's a lot of work to do there on what's remediability, how do we scope, but at Facebook size and scale, that is by far the most useful part of the UNGPs for my team.
That's very useful. But now you mentioned your team, and that was my next question. And it's slightly a nerdish question, because those of people who are policy freaks would love to know this. But you have a small team, clearly, and you have a 65,000 people organization. Clearly, you cannot help with every decision when you billions of bits of data being loaded and every day or every hour or whatever it is. The statistics are almost irrelevant here. So what kind of internal mechanism do you see? Do you see periodic training, in-person training is not possible, but is it like things like this kind of a session? Is it an online tool? Is it embedding the ideas in the levels of organization by getting external speakers come in and talk and raise challenging questions? What are the kind of things you will be doing as you roll it within?
That's fabulous. And I am going to turn that around to you as a human rights expert in business and human rights and say, what advice do you have for me? But in order to give you a moment, I'll say, we already work on two axes, right? First of all, at a company this size and speed, human rights and the rights protections have to be built in the frameworks. And they have to be built in frameworks of decision-making, frameworks of prioritization and training and onboarding. So already working in tech, there is at least a very usually robust and swift set of decision-making, alignment and escalation processes that take place every day around individual level decisions. This piece of content, that particular implementation, for example, and they're called escalations, and the escalation pathway is very important, and having the human rights team and the legal team and other stakeholders on those escalation pathways is well established because of our membership in GNI. So this is where I'm saying GNI is actually quite a strong foundation for aspects of the policy. Then we have the legal side of this, the value chain, the supply chain, again, well established through our sustainability teams. In product, it is more dynamic. And this is where we also have to look at the extreme horizontal coordination burden of tech, where unlike the UN, or actually it's quite like the UN in some ways. In the UN, you've got this huge horizontal coordination, and then it goes up. So we will be looking at every tool, and we are looking at training. We are, as I said, the leadership of Jen Newstead and Nick Clegg will be very important because they have the capacity to authorize and give life to the frameworks that allow this to live, breathe, and be effective. In addition, this is not just, it's important to recognize this isn't just a compliance policy. A lot of human rights policies in business are about compliance. They're really about supply chain management, right? And then crisis management, particularly for natural resource companies. This is also, because of Facebook's business model and because its mission, which is, along the axis of build voice and community and create social impact. It's all about human rights, goddammit. So that makes it particularly tricky, but we can leverage from that, right? That's actually wonderful support. It's a wonderful supportive framework where people want to build community voice and social impact. And this is more a sense of disciplining them to make tough trade-offs and to prevent and mitigate risk. So we will be using training. We have already positioned this team as a source of support to decision makers and joy, where we can help teams solve tough problems by guiding them as to human rights impacts and trade-offs. And then by working with major initiatives such as the Responsible Innovation Team, which really does have the ability to counsel product teams across the entire company. But yeah, so that gives you a kind of just a thumbnail scratch. It's training, and it's decision support, and it's comms, and it's frameworks. And in content, because the community standards, values, and frameworks are fairly well aligned with human rights, there's more to do, but we also have this wonderful operational grievance mechanism with the oversight board, right? So you've already got a productive friction and input cycle there. The question will be is how we embed it in the rest of the company, and what's the best practice? What's the example you'd like to tell me that I should go, whose throne do I go and sit and worship at in order to develop my ideas?
I mean, the examples I have are, from other industries, for example, completely. And the one industry I know relatively well is extractive, oil and mining and gas companies. where they, at an early stage, they realize that, it's not simply a question of when you go into a project that the engineers lead the decision making, but you make sure that the anthropologists go in as well. And they started recruiting them. So what it probably means that the expansion of the team, not just by getting people who are skilled in specific engineering, financial, and legal domains, but understanding human behavior. I'm sure you have loads of them already for good reason, because you want to monetize the data. I mean, you're a business after all, you're not a charity. So yes, of course you have them, but to start thinking in terms of how those decisions can actually be embedded, and that's greater exposure that comes in, which is where in a way it leads into my next question, which is indeed that when there's a shortage of people to take this decision, there, at least in tech companies, the impression I get from outside is to look at it from the perspective of technological solutions, algorithms, machine, artificial intelligence, helping take the decision. In a way, it sounds as though you're bringing John Rawls to life, because you've got you've got this veil of indifference coming in, and so that you're making the best possible decision. But it also forces people in specific direction. I mean, that was one of the criticisms of Facebook, that once you like something, you're shown something slightly more extreme in that direction, and so on. So that's one danger that can come from that by relying on the technology. The other is, therefore, you want human oversight, but then that's cultural relativism becomes the problem, right? That you have somebody who's used to Californian libertarian principles versus somebody who's very well aware of even mainstream British perception about what can and cannot be said, and takes the cancel culture very seriously in the other sense of the term. So having a human intervention also becomes difficult. Now, again, I appreciate it's a balancing act. You go proceed as you go along, but I'm sure you've thought about it. And I'm just curious, where has it brought you?
I love your reference to Rawls. I think about Rawls all the time, as an important element of, it's a good fairness test, right? At least in an artificial sense. And one is, with 100 billion posts a day and with multiple human rights risks around the world, you get these incredible conundrums about every half hour where you go, they've done what? And then you have to think, okay, how can I solve this? I don't have time. I have to solve this on first principles. And not that necessarily I'm the solution, and as a human rights activist, to go back to first principles and go back to the GNP, the guiding principles, and say, okay, scope, severity, and remediability, how do I prioritize? What can I solve for? In this, so what I think I have learned, first of all, there are many different problem sets that you're alluding to, right? And problem types. So, and of course, we'd like to think in the narrative that a company is so big or so powerful or so modern or so innovative, it must be able to solve everything. And I said, no, of course not, right? So what is the most effective thing we can do is often the best answer. What is the most effective thing we can do? What is the most important problem that we can solve for? What is the most human? What is the way we can defend the most vulnerable or prevent the greatest risk from happening, right? Because no human has this omniscient power. So I think in tech, and it's interesting, I spent about 15 years as a human rights worker and spent about 8 years in social impact tech. And that power of that question of what are we solving for and what are we prioritizing are the two most powerful questions I think I learned. Because I, of course, as a human rights defender, I wanted to and still want to articulate injustice, articulate a claim for justice, and solve for the cruelty and prevent the cruelty, injustice that I see. And as a transitional justice expert, or the so-called, whatever you want to call it, I looked at the experience of entire countries and communities where rights and lives had been brutalized on a massive scale. So that you have post-genocide Cambodia, post-genocide Rwanda, post-Saddam Hussein Iraq. And to get any sense of remedy, any sense of affirmation of the meaning of human rights principles, you had to really think about systems at scale. And I don't mean that as a cliche. I mean that just this judicial model that we have in human rights, somehow a judge is going to hear you and make it well, and an individual case can trigger an individual claim. It just doesn't, it is perhaps an anachronism, or not anachronism. It's not the most useful framework when we're thinking about what is meaningful exercise of rights and remedy on social media when first of all, people are articulating, protecting and defending rights every second, right? And I don't just mean economic, I just don't mean civil and political rights. I also mean economic and social. Absolutely. One of the things that's interested me most in my work to date is in the due diligence, which is largely qualitative, the model of human rights due diligence, but actually it also needs to be quantitative, right? Because in a country of 1 billion people, the experience of 30 people tells you more or less nothing, right? Mm-hmm. You have to look at how to get to the experiences of a statistically significant sample. But to treat them as rights holders, right? And not as, anyway, people are exercising these rights, and there are these violators that are violating. There are individual users that are being horrible to other users. There are governments repressing this. And then there are the harms with which the platform may be more directly involved. These are often areas, this may be problems in the rule set, the community standards, or problems in design, right? And then there are a host of problems that just aren't defined in human rights standards, and misinformation is one, right? If you speak to Irene Khan, she will be very clear, the current rapporteur, is that there's no articulated human right to accurate information. And that, because it's such a double-edged sword, whoever has the power to articulate what true information is, has the ability to organize an entire social order. That shouldn't be the platform, it shouldn't be a government. So what does that tell me? It tells me that to approach this with humanity, seeking to do the best that one can for the most important problem, is the way that we can all coalesce or all begin to identify actionable steps. So in Myanmar, one of the most important steps was to, and it's terribly unfashionable and incredibly important, was to ensure that Myanmar, the only country in the world that wasn't using Unicode for its underlying font encoding, it was using a system called Zauji. It was that Alphabet and Facebook together supported Myanmar's transition to Unicode. So that automatic tool, so that finally all of that text could be machine readable, could be detected by underlying systems, and that the automated systems could take protective measures on that text. That didn't answer the problem perfectly, but it was one very important part of a very important problem. So I think that human capacity to prioritize and that human rights capacity to prioritize and define priorities and steps is crucial in all of this. It's not about the machine or the algorithm or the person. It's about the decision to care about and prioritize the issue and do what you can without pretending you can do the impossible or that you are all powerful.
Now, you wouldn't say this, and I wouldn't even pretend to say that either, that, if these policies had been in place, the terrible killings in the Christchurch mosque would not have taken place, or Myanmar, the treatment of Rohingya would have been different. I mean, I'm not at all going there. But to do that, that embedding becomes crucial. And one thing we learned, because we have a report out, so I can name the company. This was Ericsson, and we worked with them some years ago. And one of the problems they had was indeed this kind of dual use of technology. And what do you do when things go, and how do we work on it? And one of the things that came up in our conversations was that, when you develop a particular technology, think of the worst harm it can do to somebody who is vulnerable. And then if it is happening, then however cool it might seem, don't do it. Now that sounds, very motherhood and apple pie, and it's the kind of thing that could come from a human rights activist. But it was good to hear this from a company. And I'm just curious whether there are things like that you would be talking, or you are already talking, and if so, because that probably is a way to embed the policy and take it further down.
Yes, sure. I mean, definitely those conversations are live, in Product Anywhere. And of course, one of the issues here is you can't prove a negative. You can't prove that somebody would have done X, or did do X, and thus X didn't happen. So, for example, and this is a problem. This is a real problem because it means you can't really measure impact, and you can't necessarily show impact. One small example of this is the very significant effort that Facebook, along with others, invested in protecting the integrity of the Myanmar elections in November 2020, where we ran for more than a year and a half. 40 teams worked to ensure that, for example, that transition to Unicode was done, that we could detect the texts, that we had an ad system that had defenses, that I moved my team to Singapore to handle escalations. And the result is that there was no crisis at that time, right? And then the country falls into crisis on its own a month later, where again, we at least had those integrity defenses, and so could run and revive that entire set of defenses at very short notice, which we are still doing to try, and it can't really help the country, but we can protect the platform and the users on the platform, us worsening the situation, right? In quite a significant way, I think, in Myanmar. So, but there are lots of examples like that. I mean, we could, of course, Facebook, another example that I was directly involved in, where we used human rights due diligence to not agree to do contact tracing. You may have seen at this time last year, there would have been a whole series of conversations about human rights principles for contact tracing. Amnesty International came out with an important statement. And as a result, not as a real statement, but as a result of concerns very similar to those concerns and due diligence, we did not assist any contact tracing efforts, although we did do much larger data for good and symptom survey efforts, right? So yes, I see that all the time. I mean, sure, we could help the largest contact tracing effort in history and accidentally deliver data on sensitive users to terrible repressive governments and good governments and freak the world out, but we didn't do it. So I'm not going to take credit for that, but I'm going to say that is quite a robust example of what you're talking about. Another example would be business partnerships to expand connectivity in COVID, where some of the due diligence we did was about, well, should we at this time do certain partnerships to expand connectivity in these particular regions or countries, or should we not? Would we be bringing harm that overrides the benefit? And some of these questions are simply unknowable. And it's more what posture you choose to take and your ability to define what is the actionable lever you have and what data is available to guide you in the choice that you're going to make. And I think in one of those examples, we made a limited decision to assist people's ability to communicate given the public health crisis, but to have various other defenses in play to limit any downsides. And that, as far as I know, worked quite well.
No, this contact tracing is a very good example. We have some work coming out soon on tracing and tracking, which of course we'll share with you on that topic. But that takes me to the final question, which is about the data. And you sit on a lot of information and you know more about every individual than their partners and parents and children, probably. You as in the company, I mean, has access to the data and can, if they wish. And it cannot be left to the goodwill and good intent of the current chair and the current board and current this and current that. Tomorrow it might be taken over by another entity. There might be another rival which has the same technology, different set of rules, and all kinds of things can happen. Obviously your policy is not going to address that in a very detailed manner, but privacy has become such a big issue, particularly after Cambridge Analytica and all the stories that we are familiar with. I'm just curious if you can elaborate your thinking and expand a little bit on that about privacy, the individual, and big data.
Absolutely. And acknowledge that for many people, as they think about dig tech, this is the critical issue, right? And also that the underlying human rights framework on the right to privacy is to some extent anachronistic, right? It hasn't been updated to reflect technological innovation or the very widespread and generalized concerns, particularly in an era where surveillance is spreading extremely rapidly. And then you have new technologies such as AR, VR, or facial recognition, more particularly, that is not regulated and has spread like wildfire. And I think the key thing there is, first of all, we recognized all human rights, right? Including the right to privacy. And we do have a robust history of protecting individuals from overbroad and arbitrary government requests, like the ICCPR, but where everybody's mind immediately goes to either the business model or to Cambridge Analytica. I think it's very important to know that in our policy, we talk about and clearly signal out the work of the Privacy XFN and of the entire privacy team, where of course they are operating under a very significant FTC settlement, which is unprecedented in nature and with very, very, very detailed implementation. So when we talk about human rights steps, I think it's important for people to be aware that both that background exists, but also that there has been a series of actionable steps taken so that people can control their data. They can see online sharing. They can download it. The industry as a whole, with Apple and Google, is also moving to more conscious privacy by design practices. So I think the question will be is, how do we take generalized concern, wrap it in human rights standards, and create actionable requests, right? And that to me, and what's really interesting is my personal experience as a human rights defender is, of course, I know very little about privacy law, but for example, in considering or in seeking to assist the independent investigative mechanism on Myanmar, the main barrier was the Stored Communications Act, which prohibits us from sharing data with foreign government entities in the case of the Gambia, and there's litigation about that. But that, in fact, my own knowledge of even the fundamental bedrock of stored communications privacy in the GPDR was so weak. And so that we routinely have human rights groups coming to us about cases and saying, no, yeah, can you tell us what happened in this case? And the answer is no, it's private information, we can't. So the answer will be is, how do we take the concerns and make them actionable? Test what's going on, do the disclosure, and iterate together. And that's one reason why. So I want to signal that I think the question is very open. And as a human rights community and as someone working at one of these tech companies, we have to be able to address this question and to run due diligence about it.
So you don't have at all a job one would envy. I have to say that in conclusion, and you have in the hour or so that we have been talking, probably another few million bits of pages and posts have gone up on Facebook, which of which at least a small minority, which itself would be in hundreds of thousands, would probably raise certain red flags. So it's not an enviable job. And so good luck in everything you do. And we will be watching, we will be applauding when you get things right. We will be blowing the whistle when things are wrong. And we hope that the kind of respect for human rights we want in the real world and in the online sphere, regardless of that, is such that it is consistent with the main standard, that the powerless gets his or her voice, and the defenders, the marginalized groups, the vulnerable groups get the space that is being denied to them by those with power. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Get your whistle ready, get your celebratory laurels ready, and let's try to make this thing take off. Thank you very much for the chance to speak with you.